So, hello there, and welcome back to another Night of the Movies podcast. And in these podcasts, I talk all things movies and TV, and whatever I want, whenever I want. And in today's podcast, I'm talking about why I think Arrested Development, at least in its first 3 seasons anyway, might be the best sitcom of all time. But before I do that, I should say what I say at the start of every podcast I do, and that is, if you are watching this podcast on YouTube, hello there to my viewers, but you prefer to listen to your podcasts, we carry this one at Night of the Movies on Spotify, and if you are already listening on Spotify, hello there to podcast listeners, then you can also check this podcast out visually on my YouTube channel at Night of the Movies on that platform too. Likewise, wherever you may be watching or listening to this podcast, don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this podcast, of course, and leave me some feedback on things to improve on in future podcasts, because there's always things to improve on, and feedback is much appreciated. Also, I should say, people who've been following my channel recently will know what I'm going to say here. It is still the ongoing saga of hay fever. Yes, I first spoke about problems with hay fever a good couple of weeks ago, a good few weeks ago actually, on this channel, and those problems have continued. Although my hay fever doesn't seem too bad today, I am recording this in the morning when my hay fever is usually at its worst, so I might be sniffling throughout this podcast, and I might sound a bit bummed up in this podcast, and I'm not in top form either, because that's what hay fever does to you. But other than that, this should be a great podcast and a fun podcast to listen to and or watch. So let's get into it. Arrested Development, and why I think this might be the best sitcom of all time. So, the first 3 seasons of Arrested Development ran from 2003 to 2005, and the show was created by Mitchell Hurwitz, I think that's how I pronounce his name, and it follows the Bluth family, who are a wealthy family who lost everything, and we get this one son who has no choice but to keep the family together. Now, I paraphrased a bit there, but that is quite literally the Ron Howard narration which tells you about this family, which happens at the start of every episode, or almost every episode, of this series. That narration there about a wealthy family who lost everything and the one son who had no choice but to keep the family together, that is said at the start of almost every episode in the first 3 seasons of this show. And if you hadn't guessed already, I absolutely adore this series to pieces. I love it, and for the best part of the last 2 weeks, I've been rewatching it constantly. I think I've seen Series 1, Episode 2 about 7 times now, and to be honest, I'm going to watch it quite a few more times over the next couple of weeks as well, because of how funny it is, and how clever and well thought out, but also how spontaneous the gags are in the show, and how clever the writing is, and how compelling the plot and the story is at times, and how well it's directed. You know, you got the likes of the Russo brothers and Paul Feig, you know, before they became big name directors, doing this show, and there's this mockumentary style that you get with the likes of The Office, Parks and Recreation, Modern Family, and so on and so on and so on, that you get in this show, and it almost feels like it's catching these characters in the act, because a lot of the characters in this series are quite unlikable. They do some really bad things, you know, particularly the matriarch of the family, which is Lucille Bluth, and the patriarch of the family, which is George Sr. You know, in the very first episode of the show, you see George Sr. go to prison, you see him get arrested, you know, and they do some quite inconsiderate things throughout the show, many of these characters. But they're still so funny to watch, and you can invest in their character arcs. And even though this is the family that you follow is an unlikable family, there's so many heartfelt moments in this show, and so many moments which make you smile, and so many recurring jokes and characters which are outrageously funny. And at the same time, there's so many stories going on in the show, because there's so many main characters in the series, and so many recurring characters, what he mentioned, that coming in and out of the show, you know, quite a lot. And the thing is, though, the show never feels messy. It never feels like one big mishmash. Everything is done in a coherent fashion, and the storylines gel well together, they cross over well, and there's payoff in every episode. But at the same time, it's one of those series which you could binge. You know, I don't really like using that word, but you could binge a show if you wanted to and get so much out of it, because there's an underlining story going on throughout each series and the entirety of the first 3 seasons. And I will go on to season 4 and 5, which when the show got survived. I will get on to that a bit later in this podcast, but for now, I'm just talking about the first 3 seasons. Yeah, it's incredible, this show. The writing is incredible. It's so smart, it's so sharp, and the gags are so well planned, and they feel spontaneous, but then when you look back on them, you go, oh my god, that was so well thought out. And the Ron Howard narration is like the cherry on the icing on top of the cake. It just, pardon me, it just makes this show perfect. In my opinion, the first 3 seasons of Arrested Development are utterly perfect. And, you know, I could sit here and go, well, this is my favourite episode, this is my favourite episode, this is my favourite episode of Arrested Development. I could go on and on about my favourite episodes, but in reality, I think about 90% of the show is just perfect. I think there's some episodes which aren't as good as others, but you get that with any TV show, comedy or otherwise. You know, you get that with any TV show. Some episodes will always be better than others. But the thing is, with Arrested Development for me, there's about 90% of the series which I think is just perfect. And even the episodes which aren't perfect, they still got a lot of funny moments. They're just not great. You know, they're just not as good as some of the other episodes. And when the show is at its high, I mean, it's on another level of comedy. Because, you know, I first watched the first 3 seasons of the show about, I want to say about 10 years ago now. Man alive, it's been a long time since I first watched the show. And I watched it the full way through once, and then I didn't rewatch it. And there was a couple of weeks ago when I was on holiday and my brother stuck it on, and I just got glued to the screen. I forgot how good the show was. And I've been rewatching it constantly since. But in between when I first watched the show and in between when I started to rewatch it again a couple of weeks ago now, I'd seen a lot of other comedies the full way through. I'd seen The Big Bang Theory the full way through. I'd seen How I Met Your Mother the full way through. I'd seen Friends. I'd seen Modern Family, or most of Modern Family anyway. I'd seen Barry, which, you know, somehow Barry is classed as a comedy. I don't quite get that. If you ask me, it's more of a thriller, but, you know, apparently, according to the Emmys, it's classed as a comedy. So I've seen Barry, I've seen Ted Lasso, I've seen Community, which is a great show. I've seen The Simpsons, quite a lot of The Simpsons, and that. I've seen quite a lot of episodes of Family Guy, and I've seen all these different comedies: Parks, Recreation, The Office, the UK version, US version, Extras, The Outlaws, the Stephen Merchant Show, which I think is very much underrated, currently on Amazon Prime. I'd definitely recommend it if you haven't seen that show already. And I've seen so many comedies. That's the point I'm making. I've seen so many comedies over the past couple of years, some of which I've absolutely loved, but none of them have compared to Arrested Development. None of them have compared to Arrested Development in their writing, in their storytelling, in their directing. You know, yes, The Office and Parks, Recreation and Modern Family, they all have the mockumentary style filmmaking that you get in this show, but here it feels more real. It feels like it's grounded more in verisimilitude. If you don't know where it is, look it up. But yeah, it feels like it's grounded more in verisimilitude, the directing the show does. And yeah, I think it's masterful, the way it's all balanced, the way storylines all intertwine one another, because there are so many characters. I'm going to try and explain the Bluth family tree right now, so it's going to take a bit of time, so bear with me. You have the main character of the show. You have who was essentially the main character in Michael Bluth, played by Jason Bateman, and he's got a son called George Michael. Yes, that is actually the name of Michael's son in this show, so it's a bit of a running joke that goes throughout. And Michael has a brother, though, called Gob Bluth, who is into magic, although as he likes to call it, illusions, you know. And they've got a sister called Lindsay Funke, who is married to Tobias Funke, but they're in a failing marriage, but they've got a kid together called Maybe. Yes, her name is actually Maybe, and George Michael, who is Michael's kid, is in love with Maybe. Yes, George Michael is in love with his own cousin in this show. You can't make this stuff up, although apparently you can. You know, at the same time, though, on top of all that, you have Buster, who is the 4th Bluth sibling, and he is the brother of Michael and Job and Lindsay. However, Buster is a bit of an odd one out because he has this unhealthy relationship with his mother, who is a matriarch of the family in Lucille Bluth. And Lucille Bluth is married to George Sr., who you see go to prison in the very first episode. And if you wanted to add another stem to that family tree, you also get George Sr.'s identical twin brother, Oscar, and they're both played by the same actor. They're both played by Jeffrey Tambor, and I know Jeffrey Tambor is a bit of a controversial actor right now, but, put that aside for the next couple of minutes. They're both played by the same actor, and you wouldn't know it, though, because of how well Jeffrey Tambor, plays both characters differently. And the biggest difference between both characters is that George Sr. doesn't have hair, really. He's mostly bald. And Oscar, who is George Sr.'s identical twin brother, has hair like a lion. That's what they say in the show. That's what Lucille says. And Oscar, who is George Sr.'s identical twin's brother, who's married to Lucille, has had a past with Lucille. Hopefully you understand what I mean there. If you've seen the show, you'll know what I mean. I tried to explain the family tree there. I don't know how well it did, because there's so many main characters in the series. That's the point I'm making with all that stuff with the family tree. There's so many members of the family that you follow, but it never feels messy. It's so well balanced. It's massively balanced, because on top of all the family tree and all the main characters that you follow, there's also all these recurring characters that come in and out of the show throughout. You have Henry Winkler, yes, the Fonz himself, as the family attorney, Barry Zuckerkorn, and every time he's on screen, even in the later seasons, which aren't as good, and again, I'll get on to them a bit later, even in the late seasons though, Barry Zuckerkorn, I laugh my head off every time he's on screen, because it's Henry Winkler, and he's so funny in this show. You also get Liza Minnelli as Lucille 2, who Buster has a relationship for a little bit. She's in series 1 and 2. I don't think she's in season 3, although she comes back when the show got revived. Also, you get Carl Weathers as Tobias's acting coach. Carl Weathers in the show plays a struggling actor, and in reality, I don't think he's a struggling actor. He's in the Predator franchise, and he was in the Rocky franchise. I think he's alright. He's also in Mandalorian now. I don't think he's a struggling actor, but, you have him in this series, and he's Tobias's acting coach, and he's playing a version of himself, but he's so funny. And then you get Ben Stiller as Tony Wonder, who is Gove's magician rival. And, did somebody say Wonder? He's in series 1, he's in series 2. I don't think he's in season 3. Oh no, he might be in season 3 actually. I think he might have a small cameo in season 3. But yeah, you get Ben Stiller, one of the recurring characters in this show. There's a recurring character of Steve Holt, who's the popular kid in school. Steve Holt! That's what he does every time you see him in the show. And there's more to that character than it seems. I won't go into it in case people haven't seen the series yet, but there's more to that character than meets the eye. And then you get Anne Veal, who is George Michael's on-again, off-again girlfriend. You get Julie Louis-Dreyfus as this lying lawyer. You get Judy Greer as Kitty, who's George Sr.'s assistant, who he's been having this long-term affair with. And as I've already mentioned, you get Oscar, who is George Sr.'s identical twin brother, who has had a past with Lucille, who is the matriarch of the family. There's so many characters in the show. That's the point I'm making. There's so many characters. Charlize Theron, I never know how to pronounce her name, but if that's how you pronounce it, yeah, you got it right. If it's not, I apologise. But Charlize Theron, you also get her in the 3rd season of the show as Michael's British girlfriend, and she is so funny. And yeah, there's so many recurring characters. I haven't really touched the surface of the recurring characters of this show, who just come in and out throughout, and they all have their moment to shine though. All the recurring characters have their moment to shine in this series, and all the main characters as well. It's so well balanced, and I know I keep saying that, but the amount of character you follow in the series, it's really, really surprising and shocking at times how well balanced everything is, and how it doesn't feel messy, and how the writing is so sharp, and how all these characters have their own storylines and their own character arcs. There's so many of them, and each episode is only about 23 minutes long. These episodes aren't 40 minutes long. I mean, they got to 40 minutes long in the later seasons, which I'll go into a bit later in this podcast, but in the first 3 seasons, the episodes are only, 20 minutes long, and, they're following all these different characters, and it doesn't feel messy, which is so amazing, because there's so many storylines, and if you don't really like one storyline, well, guess what? 2 minutes later, you follow another storyline which is just as funny and that actually makes the other storyline better. And yeah, the way all these storylines intertwine with each other and cross over is genius writing, and it's so clever and it's so sharp, and the recurring jokes in the show as well. I mean, there's so many long-running jokes throughout the series. I mean, just the character names, first of all. You get George Michael, you know, and every time they say that name in the series, we immediately think of the artist, and actually it's the character, it's Michael's son. And then you get the character Maybe, which, you know, in itself is a funny name. Tobias Funke, you know, because if you spell Funke on a piece of paper, you might say it out as funky, you know, if you read it out loud, but in reality it's called Funke in the show, so there's that as well. And Job, which many people call Gob in the show, and yeah, there's a lot of characters like that in the series which have these funny names. And there's also recurring jokes such as the family stair car, which they all have to drive around in, Mr. F in series 3, Oscar being the real father of Buster, which is a very funny joke, you know. Every single time Buster and Oscar in a room together is like, oh, I know who your real father is, you know? And then you get Tobias and whether he's actually gay in real life, George Michael and Anne's relationship, which Michael doesn't really get. He goes, Anne? Who's Anne? You know, every single time George Michael says the name Anne, it's like, Anne, have I met Anne? I'm not sure if I met Anne. Oh, Anne! You know, maybe getting a job in the film business in series 2, and Buster potentially joining the army. Those are long-running gags that happen throughout the show, and every single time they pop up, though, they're just as funny as when you first heard it. I don't know how they do it. I don't know how they wrote this show, but it's so well planned and so well orchestrated, and the gags, I can't go on about enough, because there's all these songs coming together with these gags, and it's so funny. I don't know how they made this show. It's so well edited, so well directed, and just laugh out loud funny. In the character relationships, the relationship between Michael and Gob is my favourite aspect of the show, because Gob is a bit of a wild card and Michael is a straight man, you know, he's a person who's trying to keep the family together, and yet just their relationship is like chalk and cheese. It's so fun to watch. And the relationship between Linz and Tobias, the way that goes, the on again off again relationship there, and yeah, there's so many great relationships in the show. And right, so this is an add-on. One thing I forgot to mention when I was doing my review, and I was a bit annoyed that I forgot to mention it, but one thing I did forget to mention was that the show is complex in its plot, but it never feels too complicated to understand. Like, it's all easy to understand, and that's coming from me. I'm not a very smart person, and usually in a Christopher Nolan film I get lost quite easily, but I didn't get lost watching this show at all. I mean, I got lost in the last 2 seasons, but that's because they were the last 2 seasons, and I didn't really like those seasons too much. But in the first 3 seasons of the show, there's a lot going on. The plots at times are quite complex, and the story does get a bit complicated, but I never felt stuck watching the show. I never felt it was too complex for me to understand. It's easy to understand. That's the point I'm making. Anyway, back to the podcast at hand. Also, I'm going to say this. Yeah, you know what? I am going to say this. I think that Succession wouldn't have happened without this show. I think that Succession... That's what I'm trying to say there. I think Succession happened because of this show. That's what I'm trying to say. I think Succession wouldn't have happened if this show didn't happen, because there were a lot of big similarities between this show and Succession. You know, you get the patriarch of the family, who's the owner of the company. You get the Bluth company in the show. He is the owner of the company, and he has had multiple affairs in his time. And he's getting to the age now when he wants to retire and he wants to give up the company. And you get the son in the family who's trying to take the company over, and he's trying to keep everyone together. I mean, you don't really get that in Succession, but, you know, in this series and Arrested Development, that's Michael. In Succession, it's Kendall Roy, you know, what's his name? Jeremy, what's his name? I forgot the name of the actor off the top of my head right now. It's Jeremy something, I'm pretty sure it is. You know, you got Kendall Roy, who's a person who's trying to take over his father's business, and you get that in this series as well. And then you get the son who does everything he can to please the father. In this series, it's Job Bluth. In Succession, it's from Roy. And you get the son who's a bit out there, a bit hippish, but still involved with the happenings of the family. In this series, it's Buster. In Succession, it's Connor, you know. And then you get the sister who's in a failing marriage, and is an important asset to the family. In this series, it's Lindsay, and she's in a failing marriage to Tobias. And in Succession, it's Shiv, and she's in a failing marriage with Tom. And then the daughter's husband, who the head of the family doesn't really get along with, as I already touched on. In this show, it's Tobias. George Senior doesn't really get along with Tobias, and in Succession, what's his name? I've just forgot Logan. I just forgot the name of the head of the family in Succession. Then in Succession, you get Logan Roy, who doesn't really get along with Tom, but starts to get along with him as the series goes on. There are definite strong similarities between Arrested Development and Succession. There are really big similarities, and I do think that Succession happened because of Arrested Development. I do think one of the biggest influences on Arrested Development was Succession. I really think that. But going back on to Arrested Development, I just wanted to prove how influential the show is, though, because I generally think that is the case. But going back on to this show at hand, going back on to Arrested Development, the needle drops are so on point too, and I think the way that everything just comes together in each episode, like what he mentioned, is a show where, and pardon me, it's a show where you can watch each episode individually and get something out of it, but it's also a show that you can watch, you can binge watch it. You can watch one episode one night and it's got a beginning, middle and end, and there's a payoff in that episode. But at the same time, if you feel like it, you can binge the show and still get so much out of it, and the gags don't really get unfunny. You know what I mean? Like sometimes when I watch a show, a lot of the time, when I binge watch a show, I hate using that word, but I've used it about 4 times already in this podcast, so I'm going to continue to use it. Sometimes when I binge a show and it's a comedy, the comedy starts to wear off me. That never happens with Arrested Development. I can't tell you how many episodes I've watched at a time over the best part of the last 2 weeks. I can't tell you how many episodes I've rewatched at a time, and the jokes are still working for me, and I'm still laughing, I'm still smiling. And even so, I've seen these episodes about 3 times the full way through now. Even so, I've seen the first 3 seasons 3 times the full way through. It's still so funny, and the comedy is, it's on another level. But at the same time, as good as the first 3 seasons are, Arrested Development did get revived with Season 4 and Season 5. And Season 4 was the big revival that happened in 2013, I want to say. Or it might have happened in 2014. And I briefly spoke about my opinion on Arrested Development Season 4 in my podcast on Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, the 4th Indiana Jones movie. And when I said, from what I remember off the top of my head, from what I said in that podcast, I said something on the lines of, by the time they got around to making Arrested Development Season 4, the cast and crew involved in the show, even though most of the same cast and crew came back, they'd done other things in between, and it just wasn't the same. The spark just wasn't there because people had moved on. And it was like they were trying to flog a dead horse. That's the saying, isn't it? It was like they were trying to revive something that didn't need reviving, and the revival didn't really work so much. And the thing is with Season 4, when I first watched it, I watched it on DVD, so I didn't watch the remix version, which is still on Netflix in the UK. I don't know if it's on Netflix in the US. I read some articles which said that in the US, Arrested Development has actually left Netflix now. But in the UK, Arrested Development Season 4 and 5 are still on Netflix as of now. But I didn't watch the remix version of Season 4 initially, and I just watched the original version of Season 4, where each character has their own episode and the characters cross over, but it wasn't the same because you don't get the family together a lot. One of the reasons Arrested Development worked so well in its first 3 seasons is because you had the family together so much, and there was this amazing chemistry between all the actors, which I don't know how they made that work. I really don't know. I mean, that would have just been lightning in a bottle. And the thing is, when they came back to the Arrested Development Season 4, there's like 2 scenes in the entirety of Season 4 which have all the family together. And I remember one of those scenes, they're not really talking, though, the family aren't. And yeah, that was a disappointment. I mean, Season 4 had some really funny moments, and I'm not, I am still happy I saw it, and I am still happy it happened. But a part of me as well wishes that it didn't, because season 4 was a success for Netflix when they decided to revive it, and then they tried reviving it again in 2018, 2019 with season 5, and it really didn't work then. I mean, they had the family together more, but at the same time, you can tell they were struggling trying to get the acts on schedule. You know, that's one of the reasons the family weren't really together in season 4, and that's why they're together in season 5, because that's one of the big complaints in season 4, that the family wasn't together enough. But then in season 5, the family's together again, but you can tell at times that they're still struggling to get these acts on the same schedule because they're so huge now. You know, in between the original and Arrested Development and the revival, loads of the actors involved in the show, particularly Jason Bateman, Will Arnett, and Michael Cera, these actors became hugely popular, you know, in the industry. And so what happened was, when they came back, it was really difficult for the crew and the writers and whatnot behind Arrested Development to get all these actors on schedule. And you feel that with season 4 and 5, and that's one of the reasons it didn't have the same spark, because for me a lot of season 5 felt forced. I tried rewatching it, and you know, season 5 I don't dislike, but it's just not nearly as good as the original one. Same with season 4, though I will say I liked season 4 more than season 5, because I did watch the full... Pardon me, I did watch all of season 4, whilst I didn't watch all of season 5. I still haven't finished season 5, and if I'm being frank, I'm not sure if I'm ever going to, because it doesn't interest me that much. And for me, when I watch season 5 of Arrested Development, the spark just isn't there, and you can tell. And season 4, when I watched it on DVD in the way it was originally formatted, I did end up enjoying, but then I did try and watch the remixed version, because when Arrested Development season 5 was coming out, the crew behind and the filmmakers behind the 4th series of Arrested Development and the 5th series decided to remix the 4th series so that all the family was together, but it just doesn't work. There's way too much Ron Howard narration. You know, I love Ron Howard, and I love his narration in the first 3 seasons of Arrested Development. That's such a genius move to have someone like him narrating all of the stuff. It's brilliant, but I don't want it all the time. And by the time you get to Arrested Development season 4 and 5, it feels like there's too much Ron Howard narration. It feels like he's trying to fill in the gaps a bit too much, and that the writers are being a bit too lazy. And so, yeah, it's a shame what happened in Revival. And season 4, I think in its original format, was actually not too bad, but it was nowhere near as good as the first 3 seasons, and same with season 5, which I still haven't finished. And I'm disappointed in myself that I haven't finished it, but I'm also disappointed in the show that I haven't finished it, because I want a reason to finish it, and yet I don't find the story that compelling anymore in season 5, whilst I watch the first 3 seasons of Arrested Development. There's something addictive about it, you know what I mean? You know, in the first 3 seasons, the story is compelling, the characters, you get invested in. You shouldn't really, when you think about it, they're not nice characters, at least most of them aren't anyway, and yet you get invested in their stories, though. You get invested in their character arcs, and it's so well written. It's addictive TV, and the way you want it to be. And the situational comedy in the first 3 seasons is unbelievably well done. And the way all these characters come together and seeing the family together, it's so funny and it's so great. But you didn't get that with the Revival, and that's one of the reasons that I do think it's only the first 3 seasons of Arrested Development which make it one of the best sitcoms of all time. Season 4 and Season 5 of Arrested Development, you know, are funny TV. It's funny TV, but it's not on the same level as the first 3 seasons. It's more on the level... of The Big Bang Theory and How I Met Your Mother. And not to say those shows are bad, I've had some fun times watching those shows, but they're just not great. I actually think The Big Bang Theory, starting here, is a show which is going to age poorly, and, you know, it really annoys me, that series, because it makes fun of geeks, and it presents geeks in this really sleazy and pathetic fashion. And as someone who's a geek myself, I know that's not true, and I've seen fellow geeks who are not like the geeks in The Big Bang Theory. But that's another topic for another day. back onto Arrested Development. I love this series so much. The writing is clever, the characters are so funny and interesting to watch, and it's heartfelt at times. There are some really great story arcs, and I love where the story goes as well. It's so unexpected, the twists and turns in the show, and the comedy feels so unexpected as well. It feels like it comes out of nowhere, but it also feels spontaneous, and it's one of those comedies that I don't think will ever be topped for me in terms of its greatness, in terms of its perfection. I mean, as already mentioned, there's some comedies out there which I absolutely love. I talked about Modern Family not too long on this channel. I love the first 5 seasons of Modern Family. I think they're incredible, and I love the first 6 to 7 seasons of The American Office. And I also love the UK Office to pieces, and I love Extras, and I love Parks and Recreation. I don't love it quite as much as some people do, but there are a lot of episodes of Parks and Recreation which I was absolutely dying at, and I love Outlaws as well. The Outlaws, the Stephen Merchant show, which is so underrated, so underrated. Check it out on Prime if you haven't already. But before you check the Outlaws out, though, check out Arrested Development, because it's so much better than all those shows. And there's no laugh track that you get in the likes of Friends or Frasier or How I Met Your Mother or whatnot. There's no laugh track. It's all just great comedy, and it's so well done. You almost miss so much of the comedy in this show because of how subtle it is, and because of how nuanced some of the comedy is, but because also of how funny you'll find in another joke, and then another joke will come along is even funnier. And oh god, I could go on and on about the series, and I already have. Let's see how long we've been going on for. Oh, that's right, we're almost at the half an hour mark, and I've been going on and on about this series, but I really, really love it. And the first 3 seasons of Arrested Development are on Disney Plus right now. All seasons of Arrested Development, as far as I know, are still on Netflix, at least on Netflix in the UK. And I would highly recommend you check the show out if you haven't already. I mean, if you have checked it out, why not rewatch it, or at least just rewatch the first 3 seasons? Even if you get to season 4 on Arrested Development and feel like you want to watch it, I'd advise you buy it on DVD. Don't watch the season 4 version on Netflix, because it's remixed and it's more plot than comedy. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of plot in this series, and the plotting is really well done in the first 3 seasons, but it's more comedy than anything else. And yet the plot serves a comedy, and the comedy serves a plot. It's so funny like that. I could go on about it, and I love the directing, I love the music choices, and I love how real it feels as well. You feel like you're watching this real family. Even so, many of the actors involved in this show, are high-profile actors now. They weren't when they did this series, and for me, when I watch Arrested Development, it feels very much like a product of its time. I mean, every film and TV show does, but this show in particular does, and I'd never feel like I'm watching actors. I feel like I'm watching characters. You just sink into these characters. And there were some episodes which are better than others, but I honestly think that about 90% of the first 3 seasons of Arrested Development is pure perfection. I really think this might be the best sitcom of all time. I mean, granted, I haven't seen some of the other, quote-unquote best sitcoms of all time, some other comedies which people consider the best. Like, I haven't seen Seinfeld, and I haven't seen... there's another one which people absolutely love. I haven't seen Scrubs, I haven't seen that either. But I have seen my fair share of sitcoms in my time, and for me, Arrested Development stands above all of them still. The more I think about it, the more I love it. It's clever and it's comedy. The gags are so well thought out and feel spontaneous at the same time. The writing is sharp, it's to the point. The story is compelling, but also is absolutely hilarious. The Ron Howard narration that you get over every single episode is so funny. And even though I didn't love the first episode of the entirety of the show, when you get into episode 2 onwards, it just doesn't stop. I mean, the first 3 seasons just don't stop being funny, and it is a massively made show, and I think it's absolutely perfect. And I don't think I've said that about any sitcom before. But you know what? I'm saying it about Arrested Development. And so, all in all, if I was going to give Arrested Development its first 3 seasons anyway, if I was going to give the first 3 seasons of Arrested Development a rating, You know what? I'm going to give it a 10 out of 10. This is the first 10 out of 10 I've given to a TV show on this channel, as far as I'm aware. I don't think I've given another 10 out of 10 on this channel to a TV review. I know I've done it to film reviews. I did it to Last Crusade, and I'm pretty sure I did it to Elvis as well. I can't remember off the top of my head. But the point I'm making is I haven't given a 10 out of 10 for a while, or ever really, on this channel for a TV show, and there's a reason why. It's a golden TV show. The comedy in the show is just gold. It's pure gold. I can't overstate this enough. I mean, I wish I could sit here and say why the comedy's funny, and it's relatable, and it's situational comedy, it's all that sort of stuff. That's why it's funny. But in reality, I think you just need to see it to see why it's funny. You know what I mean? I think you just need to see it to understand how absolutely hilarious this series is. And one other thing that I want to say, it's not really about the show, but it kind of is at the same time. This series originally ran, the first 3 seasons of Arrested Development originally were aired on the same night as The Office, Parks and Recreation, and 30 Rock. Imagine that on the same night. Parks and Recreation, The Office, 30 Rock, and Arrested Development. That would have been a night of comedy to remember. And that's another series I absolutely love that I haven't mentioned already, 30 Rock. I've seen that show, love its pieces. Although I still prefer Arrested Development. I think the situational comedy and the way storylines come together in 30 Rock is brilliant. But I like Arrested Development more because I just think the writing and the story is more compelling. But that's just me. And, it's all subjective in the end. I can see why some people wouldn't click with the show, because in the end, comedy is the most subjective thing ever. And I can see some people watching the show and really not liking the characters and not getting past the first couple of episodes. However, even though the characters are unlikable, even so many of the characters are unlikable in the series, I stayed watching it because the writing was compelling. It was an engaging show through the way it was made, through the filmmaking, but also through the characterizations and the comedy and the gags, which is just so well thought out, and the series, which is just perfect. The more I think about Arrested Development, the more I rewatch it, and the more I rewatch it. I know I said rewatch twice there, but the point I'm making is I just want to rewatch the show continuously, because the more I do, and the more I will in the future, the more I'm sure I'm going to fall in love with this show even further. Because it's a one of a kind. There's not been another series made like Arrested Development. I mean, I know I compared it a bit to Succession early in this podcast, but, Succession's a very different show. Succession's not a comedy. If anything, it's more of a drama than anything. I mean, it's got moments of comedy in that, but it's more of a drama. And the point I was making, though, is I don't think Succession would have happened if Arrested Development didn't happen. I think Arrested Development made Succession what it is. And so that shows you how influential this show has been. And I think that all comedies since the 3rd season of this show ended have all in some way, owed a debt to this show. And one other thing, and this will be the last thing I'm going to mention, because I know I've been rambling on, but I want to mention this. Even though the show came back for revival, Series 3 has a perfect ending. It feels like a series finale. It feels like a great ending to the show, and the episode is even called Development Arrested, and it's so funny, that last episode of Season 3. I think it's one of my favourite episodes. I think one of the best episodes of the entirety of Arrested Development, and you can just finish there. Don't watch Season 4, don't watch Season 5, because although they're fine, they're mostly disappointing. Even so I quite enjoyed moments of Season 4, it's mainly the first 3 seasons of Arrested Development that... Yeah, it is the first 3 seasons of Arrested Development. For me, when I think of Arrested Development, I don't think of seasons 4 and 5. I think of seasons 1 through to 3. Because it's just perfect. It's perfect. I'm not even saying the word perfect anymore, but it is just perfect. That's the point I'm making. And I'm going on and on about it because I love this show, and, I just can't recommend it enough. I really, really can't. It is, in my opinion, I'm going to say it. It's the best sitcom of all time. And it's probably my favourite sitcom of all time as well. I think it's both. I think it's objectively the best sitcom of all time. Yep. And I also think subjectively that it's my favourite as well. At least for now. And so, all in all, that's why I think Arrested Development is the best sitcom of all time. And that's why I absolutely adore it. And that's why, as I've already mentioned, I would say that this show, I would say that Arrested Development seasons 1 to 3 are 10 out of 10 from me. Anyway, guys, that's it for this podcast for today. Hope you enjoy the podcast. You know, sometimes when I talk about something that I love to pieces, I'm not sure if I make my points completely clear and coherent. So, if that was the case, I do apologise. But if you somehow stayed listening or watching this podcast till this point, thank you very, very much, because that means a lot. And as I always say, thank you as always for watching or listening. And if you haven't yet, please do click down below and like, subscribe on this podcast. I look forward to many more podcasts coming very, very soon on this channel. I might have the next couple of days off because I've got things on, but I'll be returning soon with my views of Barbie and Oppenheimer sometime over the next week. But until then, guys, as I've already said, thank you as always for watching or listening, and I will see you guys again soon. But bye for now. Bye.